All of this is available, and again, if we do get the recording successful, it'll be available on the recording, but you can find this information anywhere in different books, online, podcasts. Just trying to summarize it in this short time we have left so that we can bring into somewhat of an explanation almost of what it is that we're doing here. Remembering this is mindfulness-based stress reduction, so we're focused on the effects of stress on our body and how much of a problem stress is for us these days particularly. So again, really important that you don't need to know. I'm happy to answer other questions and things later after class. So the word stress first came into the clinical and medical world back in the 1930s when a doctor from Canada, Hans Selye, brought the term, borrowed it from engineering, and just applied it to what he was seeing in his patients. And then he really got popular by taking this around the world, explaining to people stress and what it's like to feel stress. And most people could relate very easily. Again, though, he borrowed the term from engineering as the stress is the amount of, let's say, pressure a column can hold before it breaks. And he, as you see here, he wrote that it's a non-specific response of the body to a demand for change. So it's just saying it's just a response of the body, and it's non-specific. It is not necessarily a bad thing. But most people associated stress with unpleasantness and negativity. So then in the later on, many different stress research came through. One prominent one, Richard Lazarus, you see here using his definition, because he now makes it into a transactional relationship between what the person is feeling, what they appraise they have going on, and whether they have the resources or not to handle what they're perceiving. So if you perceive this to be a danger, do you feel you have resources to take it over? And how many resources you have or don't have triggers that stress response. And that brings in a little bit of the cognitive component. So it's no longer just a purely physical component of the body reacting to a threat. And that's pretty much what most people continue to use. But in 2014, a researcher, health educator from Stanford, Kelly McGonigal, she became very popular. She wrote a book and a TED talk called The Upside of Stress. And in that talk, she does mention that there is sometimes a good stress, if you will, brought that back in, because up until then, and most of us still think that stress is a bad thing. But stress is really a biological, instinctual drive to protect us from danger. So while it may feel bad sometimes, it's really triggered because of our own need for safety and security. And so this is why Kelly McGonigal includes this sort of twisting that a little bit by saying it's what happens in your brain and your body when something you care about is at stake. When you feel that something is being threatened that you cared about, whether it's your life, a limb, a relationship, your financial status, that's when you trigger this stress response. And then I just threw in the pandemic response just because of the situation we're going through. It's our own personal protective equipment, if you will, helps us to get through some of this, what we're going through. And so the biology, the physiology of the stress, if you will, is two components, particularly to the fight or flight response, which is that response when we do feel threatened, to want to mobilize our energy and ourselves to either run away, to get out of the way, to do something to protect ourselves, or to fight back, to protect ourselves by fighting back. And the first is the stress hormones. So the stress hormones are secreted this way. So you can see here, this is what's the brain. I hope you recognize that being the brain. And down here is the kidneys with the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. The HPA axis stands for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal. So we perceive a threat out here. We have a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is considered the alarm center. And that's what sets in motion the whole fight or flight response, triggering this hypothalamus, which is a very deep part of the brain that has to do with running our rhythms, our daily rhythms, day-night cycle, sleep-wake cycle, our hormonal status, our body temperature, regulates our thirst and hunger. So it's very core basic drives. That hypothalamus is connected directly to the pituitary gland, which is called the master gland. It controls all other glands in the body, including the adrenal glands. So threat is perceived, amygdala immediately to the hypothalamus, immediately to the pituitary gland to secrete the hormones that stimulate the adrenal glands to secrete the two hormones, the two main stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And I think most of you know what adrenaline does to us. It revs us up. It starts mobilizing energy. It makes us more alert. And cortisol is also a stress hormone, mobilizes energy for using to run away or to fight. And we'll get into this in a moment, but some of the other things they do. So this is one side of the fight or flight or stress response. And then there is the nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that is under subconscious, unconscious control. It's that part of the nervous system that is running all of the organs in our body, our critical organs in our chest and our belly, for instance, running the heartbeat, regulating blood pressure, respirations, electrolyte balance, and digestion of food, making of urine, all kinds of activity that's going on through our body constantly, so that we don't have to think about it, is being regulated through the autonomic nervous system. And that, so I sometimes will say simply, it's the automatic nervous system. And it has two components. On the one side, the sympathetic side is the fight or flight side. That's called the accelerator. And then the other side is the parasympathetic, or the freeze response, and that's like a brake. So when we do see a threat and we need to run away and take care of ourselves by getting away or protecting ourselves, we usually go into fight or flight mode. When the threat is overwhelming, we will freeze. So the freeze response is triggered by the parasympathetic side, which is mostly derived through what's called the vagus nerve. And so pretty much, to put it straightforward, the fight, flight, and freeze response are adaptive responses to threats and danger. And in a simple way, when we go into fight mode, it's usually because we need to protect ourselves or someone close to us, our families or our tribe, etc., and we need to fight. So we pump up our energy, get ready to fight. And that's mediated through the sympathetic nervous system and the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. The flight is when the threat appears to be difficult to overcome, when I need to run away from. A saber-toothed tiger is coming at you, you want to run away. A car is coming at you, you want to jump out of the way. It's also sympathetic nervous system and adrenaline and cortisol. Remember, sympathetic means accelerator. Whereas the freeze response is the opposite. It's what we call in the animal kingdom playing possum. Playing possum means playing dead. Possums will, when they're attacked by a predator and it feels hopeless and they're stuck, they will actually play dead, because some predators don't like dead meat and they will leave them alone. Or if they're going to be getting eaten alive, they'll be completely collapsed and they won't feel it. But the freeze response is also, on a minor side, is what we call that deer in the headlight mode, when we suddenly pause and just freeze for a moment. That same sense of pausing and freezing just to see what do I need to do next comes through, and it comes through what's called the primitive part of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the largest nerves in the body, if not the largest. It starts in the brain and goes all the way. It goes through the throat, through the neck, to the chest. It's the biggest nerve to the heart. And it also goes to all the digestive organs, all the organs in the belly and in the pelvis. It's the primitive part, which is below the diaphragm, that triggers that ultimate collapse freeze response as a adaptive response to a threat. And so what happens with the fight or flight nervous system is that we get things like the pupils dilate. Again, this is to activate us and energize us to either fight or run away. Our pupils dilate, we get dry mouth, our heart races, our breathing increases, and the airways open up so that you can breathe more, get more oxygen in. We shunt blood away from the belly and pelvis so that we can send the blood to our arms and legs and brains. We don't need to be wasting time or energy digesting food or making urine in that moment. We need to be getting out of the way. So digestion and gut motility and such are put aside for a while, and the urinary bladder and such also relax. This is why sometimes, pardon my language, well, this is when somebody scares you, you can wet your pants. So these are all physiologic responses. And the sweating starts, the blood vessels constrict, which is why sometimes when you're under stress, you can feel very cool in the extremities. And then the stress hormones, in addition to that activation of the nervous system, again, the heart rate goes up and the blood pressure goes up. The cortisol causes the blood sugar to go up and the fat metabolism to change, to use the glucose and fats for energy, as energy sources. The immune system is also activated initially acutely by secreting lots of antibodies, so that if you do get injured, you have antibodies ready to fight off any infection. And at the same time, cortisol also activates the clotting system, so that if you do get cut, you'll clot your blood and won't bleed to death. So these are useful for an acute injury, but it will affect also the immune system by doing these, as you can see here, reducing the thyroid function and some of the natural immune cells over time. And of course, when the blood is being shunted to the arms and legs, especially when the arms and up in the upper part, we will start getting the tension in the body, and even to the point of tremulousness, tension in the neck. And the brain gets hyper alert. The eyes get focused on the threat. So the organism is ready to run away or fight and get past this, survive, and then allow it all to calm down. This all should just last as long as that threat is immediately right there. But in our day and age, so much of what we respond to is not life-threatening and is not really as dangerous as we think. And we also start ruminating on it and projecting and talking and self-criticism, as we talked before. So it's the chronicity of the stress response that's the problem. It's not so much the acuteness, but as we continue to secrete stress hormones and activate that part of our nervous system, all of these problems get chronic. So hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, if you know anybody who's taken cortisol long-term, you'll know that they do change their weight. Usually they gain weight around the belly and sometimes around their neck. Their immune system gets messed up enough that more likely to get the flu and other infection and viruses. And some people even think also cancers. Chronically stressed people get more likely to cancer through this deficiency in the immune system. The digestive system, because the blood gets shunted and the digestive hormones are reduced, the blood gets shunted from the belly. You get things like irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, diarrhea, heartburn, belly pain, and on in the belly region, and also bladder dysfunction, sexual dysfunction from chronic stress, the increase in the tension in the neck and other muscles, muscle aches, muscle cramps, tension headaches, migraine headaches. Because adrenaline is a stimulant, you get hyper. So anxiety, insomnia, and cortisol tends to be a depressant. So with chronic stress, people get this depressed. And the list goes on. But as you all can imagine, chronic stress is not healthy for us. I think most people know this. If you talk to most doctors, they'll tell you that somewhere around 70, 80, 90% of what they see in their office is made worse, if not caused by stress, chronic stress, not the acute stress. And that's the key here. Stress response, necessary for our survival. Chronic stress response, unhealthy. Also, the chronic stress response affects the brain in a particular way. That amygdala, that area that I was saying is the alarm center where everything gets set off as far as fight or flight, it increases and it gets really activated. And some people think it actually gets larger. We see increased size in the amygdala in people with PTSD, panic disorders, and severe anxiety disorder. Chronic stress also impairs our hippocampus area, where this is our memory center. So it impairs our memory. And the hippocampus is parts of the brains that are here on the side, but the important part is they are the ones that decline or degenerate with Alzheimer's and dementia. And so chronic stress can make the memory worse, the functioning worse in people with already our tendency to go in that direction of dementia and Alzheimer's. And then degeneration of the prefrontal area, which is the area up here that is our executive control center. The area of rational thinking, of planning, of creativity, of impulse control, of attention control, of how we navigate our world and things like that. So increases our alarm center, decreases our memory, and decreases our rational executive center. And just very quickly as an aside, mindfulness does the exact opposite. It reduces the amygdala activity and possibly reduces the amygdala size, increases hippocampus activity, and even we've seen new cells, new neurons in the hippocampus from practicing mindfulness, and it enhances prefrontal cortex activity. So it does just the opposite. And so, not to belabor the whole discussion, but the effects of chronic stress on the body, as you all know, as we were talking about, and you will know from your own experience, affects every organ system pretty much, from the brain to the heart to the gastrointestinal area to the immune system. Cortisol secreted chronically can weaken bones, causing osteoporosis, and it will affect the sexual hormones and fertility and things like that. So again, to really stress the point, it's not the fight or flight response, the acute stress response, that's the problem. It's when we perpetuate it and the chronicity of it. And mostly that's done through our own thinking.
Hey, Gus, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Would you mind going back to the previous slide? So I'm looking, yeah, that one. I'm looking at that and thinking like, okay, this is my life. Is it all attributed to stress, or, you know, how much of this would be attributed to the effects of aging, or, you know, some of these things could be isolated on their own, or is really when you look at this complete picture and you can identify, yeah, I've got 12 of these things. Would you, you'd say like, yeah, that's looking like chronic stress.
Well, this is where, right, this is how we tease apart. So, and the answer is, to be honest with you, I don't know particularly in individual cases, but we can use what we're doing here, paying attention to our bodies, to begin to perhaps tease apart what may be, if not necessarily known that it's from the stress response, but at least what can you do about what's presenting to you in this moment? Is there something I can do about this, or is this something that is not under my control and I do need to seek help?
Yeah. Okay.
And so here, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just said thank you.
Okay. But again, so it's a very good point, because this is how we distinguish. And again, in this course, we're ground ourselves in that you all know, really, you will know it's coming from inside of you. But just to cover this part, because again, most of the time when we trigger these responses, and you know, I have to be a little careful here in the middle of the pandemic, because we're all going through some external pressures that are not being created with our own mindset for the most part, or at least they're still out there and can still be affecting us. So ordinarily, when we're at times when things are not going so haywire around us, most of the time when something happens, for instance, road rage, When I get cut off from the person right now, and the person is long gone, and 20 minutes later, I'm still ruminating and getting pissed off in my head about that person shouldn't have this and that, and I tense up and I'm tight and I'm like in a rage scenario. It's mostly done by me perpetuating and ruminating on my head, because again, the situation is long over. But here we are in the pandemic with everything that's going on around us, that may be continuing to cause effects. That, okay, we got past the viral thing, and then we get the protest thing, and then we get the economic problems, and then we get the political, in the United States anyway, the election cycle, and then what happens after that. So it's one thing after another that can actually trigger our response. So just being a little careful. But just to put this in one other context, we can use these signs and symptoms to I would suggest strongly, use them to look for these in yourself. But sometimes you'll start seeing them in other people. So when somebody is in a fight, when we're in that fight response, that pumped up high energy response, it's the anger from very little like irritation and frustration to rage and fury, that pumping up of that energy. But it may also present as oppositional behavior, being argumentative, that there's those tense, glaring, staring, or a sense of euphoria, grandiosity. And the key that we see here is that there's an emotional intensity to the fight mode. And this should be pretty straightforward, but just pointing it out, because sometimes you may be dealing with clients or patients or students or family members that may be subconsciously going through this, and you'll be able to pick up some of these more subtle signs. So for the flight, it's the worry, fear, anxiety, all the way to panic. But we can get into the rumination about the future. Certainly right now, with all the uncertainty of our future, it's appropriate to some degree. But how it's affecting us, that's where we may have some attempt to control. There's an avoidance. There's a tendency to, when we see these in some of the students, the deflecting, the changing of the subject, not wanting to address this straight on, doing things to distract, making things up. Person gets, the SOB here stands for shortness of breath, by the way, not the other SOB. Short of breath. The person is usually, when we're in this flight mode, we can be easily startled, agitated, leading to nightmares and all of these other less common signs. We call that the emotional liability. And then finally, the brief, that shutdown and collapse. That's really something that we've seen a lot lately with the people with trauma. But it's when we go into, and again, here we are in the pandemic, lots of loss, trauma, grief, and also it goes with the shame. But we'll see this in people who have that blank stare, apathetic, look like they're numbed out, begin to dissociate, disconnect, get disoriented, feel like they're not here, freeze and immobilize. I've heard this many times. I just felt frozen. I didn't know what to do. Making poor eye contact, the speech is disorganized, they're spacey. And so here we see emotional blunting. So this is just another way to frame the fight or flight and freeze response for whatever it's worth. But again, the more important one is to really check in with your body when you're in that, and when you're getting too dysregulated, way too triggered, remembering in the circles, getting into the risk overwhelm zone. And that may be just that moment, that the wise thing to do, what to do in that moment, knowing that there's very little that can be done for what's going on around us. And so just to finish up here, and then hopefully we'll have some time if anybody has questions and answers, but just to finish up. So we have these fight, flight, or freeze adaptive responses. One more F that most people don't know about it, because it can be a good response, but tend and befriend was a, so the F and then the befriend. Tend and befriend was a response that was found when, with stress researchers started to research just women. particularly intensive care, critical care nurses, as well as wives of husbands with Alzheimer's or chronic neurologic diseases. And they found that women tended to go more into this tending to befriend response in response to the stress in the other person. Meaning that they tended to want to, sort of like a mother with a colicky infant. The mother, what does she do? Picks up the baby, rocks the baby, coos, makes smiley faces, sings lullabies, really holds the baby close, and sometimes bonding with other mothers to talk to each other and go to the park together. So this is what we found in women when they became stressed out before they went into fight or flight, but particularly when the stress was felt in somebody else. So with the empathetic resonance of the stress of the person close to them, they picked up that, triggered the stress response in them, and then they went into tend and befriend. Now we know that women, of course, do go into fight, flight, freeze, as well as men go into tend and befriend. It happens across all sides. So these are what we call the adaptive Fs. These are appropriate response to threats and stress. But just and this will be the last part of this talk, but just to especially when the stress response is chronic, we feel it's very unpleasant. It's just like what we noticed in our unpleasant events. We're stressed out. It's usually a very unpleasant feeling, and so we just feel bad. And if it's going on and on and on for days and weeks and months, we really begin to feel poorly. So we will do what I call the maladaptive Fs, which I'll explain a little more. I'll call it maladaptive just for the sake of easy to explain here. And one of the most common things that people do when they feel bad, when they feel stress, is they start drinking and drugging, taking drugs inappropriately, and we call that getting effed up. And so don't feel good, have a drink. I don't feel good, have a, pop a pill, take a drug, this and that. Or some people go into food. And then there are some people that go into the behaviors, which we labeled fornicate, for not using that other word, because behaviors can also help relieve the stress. We heard this by the way, about the using sex as a way to relieve our own stress when we worked with women prisoners. But shopping, workaholism, excessive use of social media, gambling, spending money. So these are these things that we tend to do that are not healthy for us. And just to finish the list, some people do throw fits of anger, freak out as we call it, doing all kinds of rage attacks and throwing the blame on everybody else, blaming and shaming. And other people go in the other direction, call it forget about it, meaning denying, suppressing, not wanting to feel, just really working hard, loading ourselves up with all that emotions and suppressing it, which of course one day blows up like a volcano. And for the tend and befriend, the maladaptive F for that is what we call fixing, where we get into helping everybody else. We neglect ourselves, and that leads to enabling, rescuing codependency and caregiver burnout, responding to everybody else's needs but our own. So these are what we call the non-healthy Fs. However, with the idea though that sometimes they are fitting, sometimes it is necessary, it is the best thing that you can do to comfort food. Sometimes it is wise if you've had a bad day at work and you're going home for your 6-year-old's birthday party and you're really wired out and you're really pissed off about something at work. It might help to have a drink to calm down before you attend the birthday party, or whatever else you might do, as long as you're not harming somebody else. And as what we say is, if you do this with awareness, you know that you're doing this, but it's not the best thing you can do, but it's the best thing you can do in that moment, then in the end, the results are better than if obviously do it mindlessly and repetitively. So it's really the repetitive doing of these activities without awareness that we get into trouble. Drug and alcohol abuse, overweight, diabetes, bad health. you know, the whole issues that go on with all of these bad behaviors and stuff. So, and so here's where we lead into next week's conversation about what can we do. And of course, we're in a mindfulness class, so there's that hint. So with that, let me stop the share and pause the recording.